The email came in at 7:43 on a Tuesday morning, just as sunlight was spilling through my kitchen window. I was stirring cream into my coffee when I saw the subject line, Wedding Venue Confirmation, Harrington Grand Hotel. For a second I smiled. Then I saw the name on the reservation, Grace Moore, my sister. The same sister who'd laughed when I told her I'd booked that very venue 6 months ago. The same one who'd said, "It's too expensive for you anyway, hon. Maybe stick to something smaller, more realistic." I reread the email 3 times, certain it was a mistake. But there it was, the deposit, the date, the signature. She'd copied my entire plan down to the day, even the ballroom I'd spent months fighting to reserve. My hand shook as I set the mug down. Coffee splashed across the counter, dark and bitter. Somewhere in the distance, a neighbor's dog barked, and the sound felt sharper than usual. The room tilted just slightly, and I thought she really did it. I called her before I could think. "Grace," I said when she picked up, her voice breathless, cheerful. "Hey, I was just about to call you," she said. "You won't believe it, I got the Harrington." I took a slow breath. "Yeah," I said. "I saw." There was a pause. "Oh," she said, realizing. "Listen, don't be mad. They said your deposit was still pending, so technically it wasn't locked in." "Pending?" I asked quietly. "You mean the deposit I sent 6 months ago?" She laughed, the same airy dismissive sound she used when we were kids. "Oh, come on, hon. It's not like you own the place. And besides, we're family. I'm sure you'll find somewhere else. You always land on your feet." My jaw clenched. Grace, that venue was my dream. I spent months planning. "Don't start, okay?" She cut me off, her tone sharp now. "You're overreacting. It's just a building." For a moment I couldn't speak. Then I said softly, "You knew. You knew it was mine." She sighed, tired and theatrical. "God, you're being so dramatic." "You're engaged. I'm engaged. Why can't we both be happy?" "Because happiness doesn't usually come from stealing someone else's," I wanted to say. Instead, I said nothing. She filled the silence easily. "Anyway, I invited Mom to tour it with me this afternoon. You should come, maybe it'll help you move on." Move on. When the call ended, I stood in the middle of my kitchen staring at the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I'd never noticed how small my apartment felt until that moment. On the counter sat the wedding binder. I'd built photos of floral arches, gold accents, the map of the ballroom layout I'd obsessed over. I closed it slowly, pressing down until the pages bent under my palm. I told myself to breathe, to be reasonable. People made mistakes. Maybe she didn't mean it the way it looked. But deep down, I knew Grace never did anything without calculation. She'd been doing this since we were kids, taking the last cookie, the front seat, the spotlight. I used to tell myself she didn't mean to, that it was just her nature to take up space. But maybe some people just never learn to leave room for anyone else. That afternoon, I drove past the Harrington Grand. The building glittered against the skyline, its white stone gleaming under the spring Sunday. I parked across the street and watched through the glass doors as Grace walked in, arm hooked through Mom's. Mom was glowing, camera phone out, snapping pictures like her daughter had just bought the place. I stayed in the car, my fingers gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. When they came back out, Mom was still laughing. Grace tossed her hair, looked radiant, triumphant. She spotted my car then, just for a second. Our eyes met. She waved like nothing was wrong. Like this was normal. Like stealing was just another form of love. That night, Mom called. "Sweetheart," she began in that soft, careful tone she used whenever she thought I was about to cry. "I heard about the venue. Grace told me she felt terrible." "Did she?" I asked. "She really didn't mean for it to upset you. She just acted fast. She's always been impulsive." "Mom, I booked that place 6 months ago. She knew." "Honey, she's under a lot of stress. The wedding's coming up, and mine was coming up too." There was a pause. I could picture her frowning lips, pursed the way they always were when she wished I'd just stay quiet. "You know how Grace is," she said finally. "It's better not to cause a scene." "Cause a scene?" I laughed softly. "She took my wedding venue, Mom." Her voice hardened. You're making this into something bigger than it needs to be. Maybe it's time you stop competing with your sister. She's always looked up to you, but you push her away." That was the moment I realized she'd already picked a side. Maybe she always had. After she hung up, I sat there in the dark staring at my reflection in the window. For 34 years, I'd been told to be the bigger person, the calmer one, the quieter one. But all that ever did was make me smaller. The next morning, I went through my folders and contracts. Every document, every receipt tied to the Harringtons still in my name. Every payment traceable to me. Grace had taken the stage, but I still owned the lights. I stared at the stack of paperwork and felt something shift inside me. A stillness that wasn't peace but clarity. They called me dramatic, bitter, overreactive. Maybe this time they'd call me something else. I closed, my laptop, poured a new cup of coffee, and whispered to the empty room. "Let's see how perfect she looks without the flowers." It wasn't rage. I felt it was balance. Cold, quiet, deliberate balance. And for the first time in years, I wasn't the one being erased. I was the one holding the pen. 3 days passed before Grace's name stopped showing up in every group chat. My phone buzzed nonstop, mom, sending dress photos, bridesmaids, gushing about fittings, everyone pretending this wasn't built on theft. I muted the notifications and sat in my studio, staring at a half-finished photo shoot on my computer. My cursor hovered over a wedding image, a bride smiling beneath a canopy of light. And for the first time, the picture didn't look romantic. It looked staged, fragile, like a lie frozen mid-laugh. Tessa showed up around noon carrying bagels and an expression that said she'd already heard the gossip. "You look like someone just told you Christmas was canceled," she said, dropping her purse on my counter. I gestured to the laptop. "My sister stole my wedding." Tessa blinked. "Okay, you're gonna need to start from the beginning." I told her everything, the email, the call, the to her mom's defense. When I finished, she whistled low. "Wow, that's impressively evil." "Or predictable," I said. She leaned against the counter, tearing a piece of bagel. "So what's the plan? You gonna confront her lawyer up? Or maybe show up in a red dress on her big day and toast to poetic irony?" I laughed, a brittle sound. "No. I'm done confronting people who already decided I'm the villain." Tessa studied me for a long moment. "You've got that look again." "What look?" "The one that means you're about to do something dangerously calm." I smiled faintly. Maybe calm is overdue. That night I opened every folder connected to my wedding. The hotel contract, catering, florals, photography, live music, all in my name. Grace hadn't even bothered to change that part. She probably assumed everything would just magically switch over when she waved her credit card. I scrolled through the confirmation emails, each one marked active under Hannah Bennett. She'd taken my venue, my design, my dream day. But technically, legally, it was still mine. I clicked the first email, Harrington Grand, and hovered over cancel reservation. My finger didn't shake. One click. Then another, then another. Each confirmation tone sounded softer, sweeter, like the quiet tick of balance returning. The florist, the caterer, the string quartet gone. Refund request processed to my account. When I finished, I leaned back and stared at the screen. My reflection looked unfamiliar, colder, maybe steadier, definitely. I whispered, "Let her have her big day." The next morning, Mom called. "I wanted to talk about Grace's registry," she began cheerfully. "Do you think silver or gold serving sets are more timeless?" I almost laughed. "You're really calling me about gifts?" "Well, you are her sister," she said, as if that explained everything. "Right. The sister she stole from." Her tone turned sharp. "Hannah, don't start that again. You know she didn't mean it maliciously. She copied my wedding down to the date, Mom. Honestly, sweetheart, you're overreacting. You always have such a flair for drama." The words stung more than I wanted to admit. I said quietly, "You taught me that silence keeps the peace. It just doesn't keep the self." "What's that supposed to mean?" she snapped. "It means maybe peace was never the point." I hung up before she could reply. Later that afternoon, my dad called. He didn't usually get involved. "Your mother says things are tense between you and Grace," he said. "I'd like you to smooth it over before the rehearsal dinner." "There won't be a rehearsal dinner," I said. He chuckled awkwardly. "Come on, Hannah. Don't make this harder than it is." "It's not hard," I said. "It's finished." There was a long pause. "I don't understand what that means." "You will," I said, and ended the call. That evening, the city rain came down in sheets, softening the streetlights outside my apartment. I sat by the window, coffee mug warm in my hands, and thought about how long I'd been waiting for someone to stand up for me. Parents, friends, maybe even Grace just once. It never happened. Every time I was told to be the bigger person, the rational one, the forgiving one. But maybe forgiveness wasn't the moral high ground they made it out to be. Maybe it was just another word for surrender. The next morning I woke early and opened my inbox. A dozen emails sat waiting. Confirmation receipts, refund approvals, polite thank you notes from vendors wishing me the best in my future events. I read them like a prayer. One of them included a message from the florist, an older woman named Lillian, who'd helped me pick white jasmine for the arches. "Flowers are about timing, dear," she'd written months ago. "Too early, and they fade before the moment." I read that line again now and smiled. Around lunchtime, Tessa stopped by with coffee. "You look like you didn't sleep," she said. "I didn't," I admitted. "Let me guess, you've been planning something." "Unplanning, actually." Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean I canceled everything?" She froze. "Everything. Every contract, every vendor, every reservation under my name." Her mouth opened, then closed. "Jesus, Hannah, that's extreme." I shrugged. Grace said I was bitter. Maybe she should find out what bitter really looks like. Tessa stared at me speechless for a moment, then exhaled slowly. "You know part of me wants to talk you out of it." "Then why don't you—" "Because the rest of me wants front row seats." We laughed, but underneath the humor was something else, recognition maybe, or respect. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying old memories, birthday parties where Grace blew out the candles before I could, Christmas mornings when my gifts were forgotten, moments where I learned to smile through being second. Every memory had the same lesson: stay quiet, stay small. I stood by the window again, the city alive with faint sirens and neon. For the first time, I didn't feel small at all. When my phone buzzed, I didn't look right away. The screen lit up with Grace's name. My thumb hovered over ignore, but curiosity won. "Hannah," she said, breathless. "Weird question, did you do something with the Harrington contract?" I stayed quiet. "They're saying they don't have an active reservation. There must be a mix-up. Did you change the payment info? Or maybe you should call their billing department," I said, my voice even. "Hannah, don't play dumb. You booked it under your name." "I did," I said. 6 months ago." There was silence on the line, followed by a hiss of disbelief. "You didn't." "I did." Why would you do something so cruel?" "You called me bitter," I said softly. "You called me dramatic. Maybe I just believed you." Grace's breath caught. "You're insane," maybe I said. But at least now I'm finally unpredictable. I hung up before she could respond. The room felt strangely still after that. No guilt, no thrill. Just quiet, the kind of quiet that fills a space once lies have been vacuumed out. I walked over to my desk, turned off the lamp, and whispered, "Let her find out what happens when you take everything for granted." Outside, thunder rolled over the lake, soft and low, almost approving. When I lay down that night, I realized revenge didn't always look like fire. Sometimes it looked like water, silent, steady, eroding everything that never belonged to you in the first place. And as sleep finally came, I wasn't smiling. But I wasn't trembling either. I just felt balanced. Like justice had finally found its way home. The next morning, sunlight crawled through my blinds like it was trying to apologize for showing up. I'd barely slept. My phone buzzed every hour through the night, messages from Grace, Mom, even Dad. I didn't read a single one. When I finally checked them, they were exactly what I expected. "Grace, you've lost it. Fix this now. Mom, what have you done to your sister? She's in tears. Call me immediately. Dad, sweetheart, this isn't the way to handle things. I turned the phone face down on the table and made coffee. The steam rose slow and steady like calm in physical form. I told myself that's what I wanted, calm. Not chows, not revenge. Just silence. Around 9, Tessa showed up with her hair still damp from a shower, sunglasses pushed up on her head. So she said, shutting the door behind her, "How's it feel to drop a bomb without lifting a finger?" I snorted. Less like a bomb, more like gravity finally working. She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. Grace called me. Of course she did. What did she say? She's panicking. Said the hotel won't confirm her booking, the florist stopped responding, and Mom's threatening to sue someone. I took a sip of coffee. Then they're having a very productive morning. Tessa laughed short and sharp. You're ice cold right now. I'm tired, Tess. I've been burning for 34 years. That shut her up. She sank into a chair, eyes softening. You know, most people would scream or post some long emotional rant on social media. I don't need an audience, I said. Just an ending. She studied me for a while. You sure you're not going to regret it? I shrugged. Regret is for people who still want something from the past. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. It sounded like applause. Later that afternoon, Dad stopped by unannounced. I opened the door to find him standing awkwardly in the hallway, holding a grocery bag like it was an olive branch. Your mother said you might not be eating properly, he said. I stepped aside, letting him in. Mom says a lot of things. He set the bag down, fruit, bread, milk, and exhaled. Grace is upset. I'm aware. She says you canceled everything. I canceled what was mine. He frowned, rubbing his temple. Hannah, I know you feel wronged, but this is too much. Too much, I repeated. She took my wedding, Dad. My venue, my plan, my idea, and Mom defended her. He sighed, that weary, pacifying sound I'd heard my entire life. You know how your mother gets. You could have talked to me. I did, I said quietly. You didn't listen. He looked down like he always did when faced with something uncomfortable. You've always been the strong one. We thought you could handle things better than Grace. That's not strength, I said. That's neglect with a prettier word. He didn't answer. I watched him realize how long he'd let this family revolve around keeping Mom calm and Grace adored. His silence was the closest thing to confession I was ever going to get. He finally murmured, "You're still my daughter, and I hate seeing you like this." I'm fine, I said. For the first time, I'm fine. He nodded slowly, uncertain. Then he left without another word. When the door closed, I leaned my forehead against it and exhaled. The apartment was quiet again. I could almost hear my heartbeat in the stillness. That evening, I drove to the lakefront just to think. The sky was overcast, waves tapping the pier in soft rhythm. I sat on the bench, phone in my lap, scrolling through old photos, me and Grace at age 10, holding sparklers on the 4th of July. Mom standing behind us, hands on Grace's shoulders, not mine. Even then, I was half a step to the side, half out of frame. I remembered the first time Grace stole something that mattered. I was 8, and I'd spent weeks painting a picture for an art contest. Mom hung Grace's piano recital certificate on the fridge instead. My ribbon went in a drawer. Grace won attention. I won quiet. And quiet became my prison. Now I finally understood that silence could be a weapon too. My phone buzzed. This time it was an unknown number. I answered out of habit. Is this Miss Bennett? The voice was polite, male, unfamiliar. Yes, this is Andrew from Lakeview Florals. I just wanted to confirm the cancellation request for the Moore wedding. There seems to be some confusion. Miss Moore is insisting the event is still on. It's not, I said evenly. If she has concerns, she can take them up with her own vendor. He hesitated. It's just, she said it was a family mix-up. She sounded distressed. I'm sure she did, I said. But my account is closed. Have a good day, Andrew. When I hung up, I stared out at the water again. My reflection shimmered faintly in the gray surface. I looked older somehow, but steadier. The next morning, Tessa texted me a link. Thought you should see this. It was a local gossip blog, more family wedding in jeopardy, rumors of venue cancellations spark confusion. The photo was of Grace at a dress, fitting, smiling like nothing could touch her. The article mentioned a possible administrative error. I scrolled past the comments, half pity, half schadenfreude. Then I reached one that stopped me. A sister scorned, or just finally standing up for herself. For the first time, someone seemed to understand. By late afternoon, Grace called again. I let it ring out, then Mom. Then both together on speaker, their voices overlapping in my voicemail. You need to fix this right now. You're embarrassing the family. We can't let people see this. Their panic was almost rhythmic, like the background hum of a machine finally. Realizing it was breaking, I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of wine and listened to every voicemail. Not to feel guilty, just to document the moment. The sound of control crumbling. Later that night, Tessa called. They're losing their minds, she said. I know. You're sure you're ready for the fallout? There's nothing left to fall, I said. Just masks. The following day, the rain finally stopped. I opened my curtains and let the light flood the room. It hit the wall where my old wedding board used to hang, a collage of colors and flowers and dreams I didn't recognize anymore. I'd taken it down the night I canceled everything. Now the wall was bare, and it looked perfect that way. Clean, honest. I spent the afternoon organizing my files. No drama, no regret, just sorting. When I reached the last email folder labeled Harrington Hotel, final, I hesitated. For a second, I almost deleted it. Instead, I opened it one last time. There at the bottom of the thread was the line I hadn't noticed before. The manager had written, Miss Bennett, your cancellation has been processed. Thank you for choosing the Harrington. We hope to host another event for you soon. Another event. The words lingered. Maybe not a wedding, maybe something else, something that actually belonged to me. That night, I poured another glass of wine and stood by the window looking out at the city lights. My phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't Grace or Mom, it was Ethan, my fiancé. Hey, he said softly. You okay? I think so, I said. I heard about the mess. Yeah. He paused. Do you want me to talk to her? No, I said quickly. I don't want anyone fixing this for me. I've spent my whole life cleaning up their chaos. This one's mine. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, You sound different. I am different. Before hanging up, he said, I just hope when it's over you still recognize yourself. After the call ended, I thought about that. About who I was before all this and whether I wanted to go back. The truth was I didn't. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark listening to the faint hum of the city outside. For years I'd been told revenge was ugly, but maybe it wasn't ugly at all. Maybe it was the first honest reflection I'd ever seen of myself. Someone who finally stopped apologizing for wanting to be treated fairly. And as the night deepened, I whispered to no one, This isn't revenge. It's remembering what I deserve. By Thursday, the city felt heavier. The air, the sky, even the noise, all of it seemed to hold its breath. I walked to the cafe down the street, needing to get out of the apartment before I started answering calls. I'd promised myself I'd ignore. The barista greeted me with her usual tired smile, and I nodded back, pretending I wasn't the woman trending on local gossip blogs. I sat by the window, my coffee cooling, as I scrolled through the latest article. Family feud, sisters at war over luxury Chicago wedding. The photo they used wasn't recent, it was one Mom had posted years ago, me and Grace side by side at her engagement dinner. She was glowing, I was smiling, and anyone could tell which of us the camera loved more. The caption under the picture read, Sources say tensions have been brewing for years. They made it sound like a story. Maybe it was, I just never got to be the author. The bell above the door jingled. I didn't have to look up to know it was Mom. The smell of her perfume, lavender and control, always announced her before her voice did. She slid into the seat across from me without asking. Hannah, she said, adjusting her scarf. We need to talk. Do we? I asked. Her lips tightened. Don't be childish. Then don't be manipulative. Her eyes narrowed. I raised you better than this. No, I said. You raised me to stay quiet while Grace got whatever she wanted. Grace never wanted to hurt you. Intent doesn't erase impact, I said softly. She took my venue. You defended her. Mom sighed like I was the one exhausting her. You've always been sensitive. I laughed. Sensitive? That's your favorite word for inconvenient. Enough, she snapped. You will call the Harrington and fix this mess before the wedding. Do you understand me? No, I said simply. Her face flushed with shock. You're going to let your sister be humiliated. She humiliated herself the moment she thought she could steal something from me and get away with it. Mom leaned in, her voice low. I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but this isn't you. I held her gaze. Maybe you never knew me. For a second she didn't have an answer. Then she stood smoothing her coat, her tone cold and rehearsed. You've made your choice. Don't expect sympathy when you regret it. I won't, I said. She left without looking back, her heels clacking sharp against the tile. The smell of her perfume lingered long after she was gone, like the ghost of every conversation we never really had. When I got home, the apartment felt smaller. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop, needing a distraction. The cursor blinked in an empty document for a long time before I typed. The truth is simple. No one notices the quiet girl until she stops being quiet. I didn't know why I wrote it, maybe because it felt like proof that I still existed. That under all the headlines and drama, I was still here, thinking, feeling, remembering. Later that night, my phone buzzed. This time it was Dad. Your mother's upset, he said, voice cautious. She's always upset, I said. She thinks you're making a mistake. Funny, I said. She didn't think it was a mistake when Grace took my wedding. He sighed. Can't you two find a middle ground? There's no middle ground between theft and self-respect. Silence filled the line. Your sister's just insecure, he said finally. She's cruel, I corrected. Hannah, he said softly, you sound angry. I am angry, I said. But for once it's clean. It doesn't burn anymore. When we hung up, I stared at the dark window, my reflection faint against the city lights. Maybe this was what freedom looked like, lonely, quiet, but mine. The next morning I woke to a text from Tessa. Grace just posted a story countdown to the wedding. She looks smug as hell. I opened Instagram. There she was in a white silk robe, champagne flute in hand, surrounded by bridesmaids. The caption read, 10 days until the happiest day of my life. I stared at her smile for a long time. It wasn't joy. It was performance. I recognized it because I'd worn that same expression for years, pretending everything was fine. Later that day, Ethan came over after work. He dropped his camera bag by the door and studied me for a moment. You okay? I've been better, I said. He nodded slowly. Your mom called me. I turned sharply. What she said you need intervention. I laughed, sharp, humorless. Of course she did. Ethan walked closer, his voice gentle. I told her you don't need saving. That softened me. Thank you. He sat beside me on the couch. You've been through hell, Han. I just don't want you to drown in it. I'm not drowning, I said. I'm learning to breathe underwater. He exhaled, half smiling. That's not exactly comforting. It's not meant to be, I said. Comfort's what got me stuck in the first place. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the hum of the fridge. Finally, he said, Do you still want to marry me? The question caught me off guard. I turned to look at him. Why would you ask that? Because the wedding was supposed to be about us, he said. And somewhere along the way, it turned into a war. It's still about us, I said. Just not in the way it used to be. He studied me, then nodded. Then tell me when it's over. I'll still be here. When he left, I walked to the window. The city below looked like 1,000 tiny sparks pretending to be stars. I wondered if any of them burned for me. That night I dreamed of the Harrington ballroom, empty echoes bouncing off marble walls. The chandeliers swayed gently above, catching light that wasn't there. And in the dream, Grace stood at the center calling my name, but no sound came out. When I woke, the sky was pale gray, the kind of morning that promised rain. I got out of bed, pulled my hair into a bun, and made a list. Not a to-do list, a reminder list. 1. I don't owe anyone an explanation. 2. Silence is not weakness. 3. Family doesn't mean ownership. I folded the paper, tucked it into my wallet, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: clarity. Around noon, Tessa texted again. Grace's wedding planner just followed me on Instagram. Weird, right? Not weird, I typed back. Strategic. Grace was planning optics now. She'd always been good at playing the part. But every performance ends the same way: silence after applause. I looked at my calendar. 10 days left. 10 days until the Harrington was supposed to be filled with flowers, music, and champagne. 10 days until every lie she told would meet the truth she ignored. I closed my laptop and whispered, "Let the countdown begin." For the first time, the thought didn't hurt. It steadied me. Because somewhere deep down I knew the truth: what was coming wasn't revenge anymore. It was revelation. The days leading up to Grace's wedding felt like a countdown to a storm only I could hear. Everyone else seemed busy, celebrating, posting pictures, pretending nothing was wrong. I didn't check social media, but Tessa did. She sent screenshots with captions like "final fitting done" and "family brunch" before the big day. I barely recognized the woman in those photos. Grace looked polished, flawless, every hair in place, every smile rehearsed. Mom stood beside her in nearly every shot, glowing with pride. No trace of guilt, no hint of what they'd done. It almost impressed me how well they'd built their illusion. By Friday morning, I was exhausted from pretending I didn't care. Ethan stopped by with breakfast, balancing 2 coffees and a brown paper bag. "You've been quiet," he said, watching me from across the table. "I'm tired," I said. "From what? You've barely left this apartment." "From everything," I answered. "From being the reasonable one, the one who forgives." He leaned forward. "You know it's okay if part of you wanted this." "The payback, I mean." I looked at him. "I don't want payback. I want peace. But maybe peace looks different depending on who's holding it." He studied me, then nodded slowly. "You sound sure." "I am." He reached for my hand, his thumb brushing my skin. "Just promise me you won't lose yourself in this." "I already lost myself," I said softly. "I'm just finding her again." That night I couldn't sleep. The city outside was restless: horns, rain, wind, like the noise of all the things people tried to bury. I got up, turned on my laptop, and opened the folder where all my wedding documents used to be. I'd renamed it Balance. Inside were the cancellation receipts, each one stamped confirmed. I stared at them until the lines blurred. I thought about the first time Grace took something that was mine. Not the ribbon, not the spotlight, something small but real. I was 16, she was 12. I'd spent a week baking cookies for a school fundraiser, and she'd taken them to her own event, passing them off as hers. Mom had praised her for her generosity. I hadn't said a word. It wasn't worth the fight, I told myself. But maybe every time I stayed silent, I was building the foundation for this moment. A lifetime of quiet turned into one loud act of defiance. The next morning, my phone buzzed before sunrise. It was Tessa. "You awake?" "Barely," I mumbled. "I just got a call from one of your vendors, the photographer. They said Grace's planner is trying to confirm details, but your name's still on every contract." I smiled faintly. Let her panic. Tessa hesitated. "You know this is going to explode publicly, right? She's going to make a scene. She's always been good at that. But this time everyone's watching. Then maybe it's about time they saw the truth." After the call, I walked to the window. Dawn was creeping up over the skyline, soft gold bleeding into gray. Somewhere across the city, my family was waking up, rehearsing smiles for cameras, unaware that their perfect narrative had already cracked. Later that afternoon, I met Tessa at a small bar near the river. The kind of place where no one knew our names. She ordered whiskey, I stuck with coffee. "So," she said, stirring her drink, Are you going to tell Ethan not yet? He's on your side, you know. I know, I said. But this isn't about sides. It's about balance. She laughed softly. You keep saying that like it's some moral code. Maybe it is, I said. My family taught me what imbalance feels like. I'm just correcting the math. Her expression softened. I get it, I really do. I just hope this doesn't cost you more than it's worth. Some debts can't be paid any other way. When I got home, I found a voicemail from Mom. I didn't listen right away, but the curiosity won. Her voice was trembling but steady. Hannah, this has gone too far. Grace is falling apart. The hotel says everything was canceled under your name and they refuse to speak to her. If this is your doing, you need to fix it before she's humiliated. Do you really want your sister to suffer like this? I replayed the message twice. Then I deleted it. That evening, Dad called. Your mother's upset, he said, his tone careful. Grace is saying you're behind the cancellations. I am, I said. He went silent. You're admitting it, I'm not hiding anymore, Dad. He sighed, the sound of defeat. You've made your point. I haven't, I said. Not yet. Hannah, she's your sister. Exactly, I said. And I've spent my whole life being hers. Just once I'd like to be mine. When the call ended, I sat in the dark, letting the quiet fill the room. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even satisfied. What I felt was something colder, cleaner clarity. The next morning, I went for a walk by the lake. The water was still glassy, reflecting the early light. I thought about how much time I'd wasted trying to earn approval from people who'd already decided I wasn't enough. Grace didn't steal a venue. She stole years of peace I'd tried to build for myself. Taking it back wasn't cruelty, it was self-defense. By the time I got home, my phone was buzzing again. A new message from Grace. You win. The Harrington dropped us. The florist, too. You've destroyed everything. Hope you're happy. I stared at the words, then set the phone down. I wasn't happy, but I wasn't broken either. That night, Ethan came by again. He watched me as I cooked quiet, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, Your mom called me again. Let me guess, she said, I've lost my mind. Something like that. I turned off the stove. And what did you tell her, that maybe you finally found it? I smiled. You always know how to say the right thing. He walked up behind me, resting his hands on my shoulders. You sure this is what you want? I'm sure. Even if it means losing them, I already did, I said. He didn't argue. He just kissed the top of my head and whispered, Then I'll be here when the dust settles. After he left, I stood by the window again, watching the streetlights flicker. Across the city, Grace was probably screaming, crying, demanding answers. Mom was probably calling everyone she knew, spinning the story to make me the villain. It didn't matter. For once, the narrative wasn't theirs to control. I opened my laptop one more time and checked the final confirmations. Every cancellation complete. Every refund processed. Every tie severed. And as the clock struck midnight, I whispered to the empty room, Let them call me bitter. At least bitterness doesn't fake sweetness. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, a soft promise that the storm had only just begun. 2 days after I canceled the last contract, the world outside looked exactly the same. The sky over Chicago was pale and quiet. The air smelled faintly of rain, and people hurried down the streets with their coffees, completely unaware that somewhere in the city, a wedding was slowly falling apart. That was the beauty of revenge. It didn't have to be loud. It could live in silence, tucked neatly between emails and refund receipts. No explosions, no yelling, just balance quietly restored. I sat at my kitchen table, sipping coffee that had gone cold, and scrolled through the folder marked completed. Everything was done. The Harrington Hotel reservation, the florist, the caterer, the band, all under my name, all canceled with polite professional signatures. My inbox was full of thank you for notifying us messages. If you didn't know better, you'd think I'd handled it with grace. Maybe I had. A knock at the door pulled me out of my thoughts. When I opened it, Tessa stood there holding 2 takeout cups. Her eyes scanned my face before she stepped inside. You look calm, she said. I am calm, which is terrifying. She handed me one of the coffees and sat down. So everything's officially done. Everything, Tessa exhaled. You realize what's about to happen, right? Grace is going to find out, I said. Yeah. And when she does, she's not just going to call. She's going to explode. I nodded. Let her. Tessa leaned forward, lowering her voice. I have to ask, why didn't you just warn her or tell her to back off? Because I did that my whole life, I said quietly. I gave warnings. I gave chances. And they called it weakness. She looked at me for a long moment, then said softly, You know power can get addictive. I smiled faintly. Addiction is when you crave something. I'm not craving this. I'm done starving. She didn't respond. She just sat there studying me like she was seeing a new version of me forming in front of her. When she left, I walked over to my desk and opened my camera case. Photography used to be how I survived. Seeing life through a lens made everything look small or manageable. But now, as I held the camera, I realized I hadn't taken a single picture since the day Grace stole my venue. I'd spent months capturing other people's love, their joy, their beginnings. And now I couldn't even look at the word wedding without thinking of her smile. That afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, Miss Bennett. This is the events manager from Harrington Grand. We're following up to confirm the cancellations you requested. Yes, I said, just to verify those cancellations affect the more weddings scheduled under your name. That's correct. Understood. Refund will be processed within 5 business days. Thank you. When I hung up, I felt something unfamiliar, peace maybe. Or the first shadow of it. A few hours later, I got another call. This time it was Dad. Hannah, he said carefully, your mother's been trying to reach you. I know. She's worried. She's angry, I corrected. She said there's been a misunderstanding with Grace's wedding contracts. Not a misunderstanding, I said. A correction, he sighed. You know how your mother gets. She just wants peace. Peace built on my silence isn't peace, I said. It's control. There was a long pause. You sound different, he said. I said and hung up. That evening, Ethan came by after work. He stood in the doorway holding a grocery bag. You eating tonight depends, I said. Does self-righteousness count as a meal? He smiled, placing the bag on the counter. You're still funny, so that's a good sign. We ate quietly for a while before he spoke again. You've really done it, haven't you? I have. And you're not? Conflicted, I set down my fork. Conflicted is what happens when you still want approval. I don't. He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. I just don't want this to harden you. I looked at him. You can't harden what's already stone, Ethan. You can only reshape it. He reached across the table and took my hand. Then promise me you'll stop reshaping it before it cuts you. I didn't answer. Later that night, when he left, I poured a glass of wine and sat on the floor surrounded by photos from past shoots. Smiling brides, tearful fathers, dancing couples, all perfectly framed, perfectly lit. They looked so alive, and yet they felt so fake to me now. I found one photo that stopped me. 2 little girls in cotton dresses standing under a magnolia tree. One Grace was beaming sunlight catching her hair. I stood beside her, a step behind, half cropped out of the frame. Even as kids, we had our assigned places. I slid the photo back into the box and whispered, Not anymore. The next morning, I woke to a message from Tessa. Grace's florist called me. They're confused. She's freaking out. I smiled without meaning to. By noon, Grace had called 5 times. I didn't answer. The 6th time, I let it ring long enough to hear her voice on voicemail. Hannah, I don't know what's happening, but every vendor says their contracts are void. This isn't funny. You're ruining everything. Her voice cracked on the last word. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Then I remembered the way she'd said, It's just a building, and the sympathy faded. That night, Tessa came by again. It's spreading, she said. Everyone in her bridal circle is talking about it. People think she's cursed. I laughed quietly. That's poetic. You don't feel bad, I feel awake. She sat down beside me. You know you've spent your whole life letting them tell you who you are. Now you're finally writing your own story. I just hope you end it right. I looked out the window where the city lights shimmered like distant stars. Maybe endings aren't what we think they are. Maybe they're just mirrors. Mirrors. Yeah, I said. They don't show you who you want to be. They show you who you've become. We sat in silence for a long time. The only sound was the faint hum of the fridge and the heartbeat in my ears. Before she left, Tessa turned at the door. You know this doesn't end with silence, right? I nodded. I know, but it starts with it. After she was gone, I stood by the window again, watching the rain hit the glass. My phone buzzed one more time, a message from Grace. I hope you're proud of yourself. You always were jealous. Well, congratulations. You finally got attention. I stared at the screen, then typed back. Attention was never what I wanted. I deleted it before hitting send. Instead, I whispered to the dark. What I wanted was the truth. And somewhere far away in the silence that followed, I swear I could almost hear it starting to echo back. The morning of Grace's wedding arrived, quietly wrapped in gray clouds and the kind of cold that seeps under your skin. I woke before dawn, not because I wanted to, but because my body had been counting down to this moment like a clock I couldn't turn off. The city outside was hushed, as if it knew something was about to break. I brewed coffee, sat by the window, and watched the fog roll off the lake. It was strange. After everything, I didn't feel giddy or vengeful. Just still, like the air before a storm. The mug warmed my hands, but my chest felt hollow. My phone lit up with notifications. Tessa had sent a string of texts. It's happening. They're at the Harrington. Grace looks frantic. Another message followed seconds later. The guests are already there. No one knows what's going on. I set the phone down, staring at the pale reflection of my face in the window. For years I'd been the invisible one, the quiet one. And now, on the day she'd taken everything from me, she was the one surrounded by silence. It wasn't revenge that filled the air, it was symmetry. By 9 a.m., the first call came. Grace. I let it ring. The second time it was Mom, the third time Dad. The phone buzzed until it fell, still leaving behind a silence that felt almost sacred. I poured another cup of coffee and sat back down, scrolling through old photos on my laptop. My photography portfolio had always been full of light, sunlit faces, laughter, the illusion of forever. I opened a file labeled personal and found a single photo, Grace and me, standing in our parents' backyard at her engagement party. She was glowing, champagne flute in hand. I was holding the camera, out of focus, half hidden. Now I wondered if that had always been the metaphor. The next buzz on my phone wasn't a call, it was a video message from Tessa. My thumb hovered before I pressed play. The video opened to chaos. The Harrington ballroom empty of decorations. No flowers, no music, no catering. Just rows of confused guests shifting uncomfortably under crystal chandeliers. Grace stood in the middle of the room, her white dress bright against the dull marble, shouting at someone off camera. Tessa's voice whispered from behind the camera, "They're saying the venue was cancelled weeks ago. Under your name." I paused the video. For a second my throat tightened. Not from guilt, something else. The ache of recognition. I'd spent years being erased from family pictures, and now I'd erased myself from theirs entirely. I set the phone down, leaning back into the couch, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang for another wedding. Someone else's beginning. When the phone rang again, I answered. Hannah Grace's voice was raw, shrill. "What did you do?" I stayed quiet. "You canceled everything. The hotel, the food, the flowers, everything. Are you insane?" I took a slow breath. "You mean the venue you stole from me? You're unbelievable," she spat. "You're ruining my life. You ruined it yourself," I said calmly. "You just didn't notice until the cameras stopped rolling." There was silence on the line. I could hear muffled voices in the background, the murmur of confusion, the scraping of chairs. "People are laughing at me," she whispered finally. "Mom's crying. Dad's furious. Is that what you wanted?" What I wanted, I said softly, was for someone to finally understand what it feels like to be invisible. You're sick, she hissed. No, I said. I'm awake. The line went dead. For a long time I sat in silence. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. I'd expected the moment to feel bigger, to burn brighter, but it didn't. It felt simple, clean, like setting down a weight I didn't know I'd been carrying. By noon, the internet had started to whisper. A few guests had already posted about the disaster wedding at the Harrington Grand. One tweet read bride left standing in empty ballroom after last-minute cancellation. Another said rumor is the sister pulled the plug. Family feud much. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, I'd been background noise in my family's narrative. Now, suddenly, I was the headline. Tessa called again around 1. It's everywhere, she said. People are live streaming. Grace is having a meltdown, I sighed. Of course she is. You okay? Yeah, I said. I think I am. She hesitated. Do you want me to come over? No, I said. I think I need to sit with this, alone. All right, she said softly. Call me if you change your mind. After I hung up, I walked to my studio. The floor was scattered with old Prince portraits, landscapes, moments that once mattered. I picked up my camera, dusted off the lens, and turned it toward the window. Outside, the fog had lifted. The light caught on the edges of the glass, soft and golden. I raised the camera and clicked the shutter. The sound echoed through the quiet room. For once, the frame held only me. By evening, my voicemail was full. Mom's messages came first, half anger, half heartbreak. You've gone too far, Hannah. You've embarrassed this family. You've destroyed your sister's happiness. Dad's voice followed, tired and small. I don't know how to fix this. Your mother's hysterical. Grace won't stop crying. Please call me. And then, one from Grace again, her voice cracking. You've proven your point. Are you happy now I deleted them all? That night, Ethan showed up unannounced. He didn't knock, just let himself in with the spare key. When I turned, he was standing there, still in his work clothes, his tie loosened, his eyes unreadable. I saw the video, he said. Of course you did, I replied. He took a few steps closer. You really did it. Yes. He rubbed the back of his neck. I don't know if I should be impressed or terrified. Maybe both. He exhaled, leaning against the counter. You could have told me. I didn't want you to stop me. I wouldn't have, he said quietly. But I would have stood next to you when it happened. I looked at him, unsure what to say. You think this is the end, he asked. No, I said. It's the beginning of the silence they forced me to live in. Now they get to hear how loud it really is. He smiled faintly. You've changed. I've just stopped apologizing. He stepped forward, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. I just hope this version of you still remembers what softness feels like. I do, I said. That's why I didn't show up to watch it happen. He nodded. That's mercy, Hannah. Even if you don't call it that. When he left, the apartment felt strangely light. I walked to the balcony, the night air cool against my skin. Somewhere downtown, the Harrington's chandeliers were probably still glowing empty. I closed my eyes and let the wind tangle through my hair. For the first time in years, no one was taking my light. I'd finally learned how to stand in it. The next morning, the world felt strangely quiet, as if it were holding its breath. I woke up late, sunlight spilling across the hardwood floors, the smell of rain still clinging to the air. My phone was vibrating against the nightstand, a rhythm that had become background noise by now. I didn't need to look to know who it was, Grace, Mom, or someone trying to fix what couldn't be undone. When I finally checked, there were 17 missed calls and over 100 unread messages. I scrolled through them slowly, like flipping through a stack of apologies that weren't really apologies. Mom's first text read, "What you did was cruel. You've shamed this family." Grace's said, "You've destroyed my life. Hannah, are you proud of yourself?" Dad's was simple. "Call your mother, please." I put the phone face down and went to make coffee. The machine hissed, the aroma filling the kitchen, grounding me. Outside, the street was slick and glimmering, reflecting a morning that looked almost too clean for the chaos beneath it. I wrapped my hands around the mug and stared at the city. It was moving on as it always did. I didn't expect them to understand. They never did. By noon, my inbox was full of messages from people I barely knew. Old classmates, co-workers, distant cousins, all checking in, all pretending their curiosity was concern. I ignored them all except one. It was from Aunt Louise, my mother's older sister, the only person who'd ever quietly defended me as a kid. Her message was short. Sometimes truth takes destruction to make itself visible. Proud of you, sweetheart. I stared at the screen, my throat tightening. It wasn't validation I wanted, but the kindness still hit me like a wave. Later that afternoon, Tessa showed up at my apartment without knocking. She was holding a grocery bag and wearing the same sweatshirt she'd had on for 3 days. You need to eat something that's not caffeine and spite, she said, setting the bag on the counter. I smiled faintly. How bad is it out there? She sighed, pulling out takeout containers. Your sister's meltdown is trending. Someone leaked a video from the hotel, her screaming at the event coordinator. It's already been memed. I blinked. Memed, yeah, she said. There's one where someone put text over it. When karma RSVPs. It's awful and kind of genius. I groaned, pressing my palms to my face. God, that's not what I wanted. I know, she said softly. But that's what happens when private pain goes public. You can't control how people digest it. I didn't mean for it to go viral. I know, she said again. But people love poetic justice, especially when it wears a wedding dress. We ate in silence for a while. The food was warm, grounding, but my stomach still twisted with unease. Finally, Tessa said, You okay? I looked at her. Do you want the real answer or the polite one? The real one. I don't know, I admitted. Part of me feels lighter, like I've finally stopped playing the role they wrote for me. But another part of me keeps waiting for the crash. She nodded slowly. That's normal. After you burn the bridge, it takes a minute to realize you never wanted to cross it again anyway. Her words settled somewhere deep, quiet, and true. When she left, the apartment felt heavy again. I opened my laptop and clicked through news articles out of morbid curiosity. The headlines blurred together: bride left at empty venue, family feud ends in chaos, when sisterhood turns to sabotage. Every story had its own version of me. Some painted me as vengeful, others as heartbroken. None of them were right, but I didn't bother correcting them. Truth didn't need a press release. It just needed to exist. That evening, Ethan came over. He didn't say much at first, just sat with me on the couch, watching the soft flicker of the television. You've been quiet, he said finally. I'm tired of words. He studied me. You don't look satisfied. I'm not, I said honestly. I thought I would be, but I trailed off. But I thought making them feel what I felt would fix something. It didn't. It just shifted the silence to their side of the table. He nodded. Revenge rarely heals. It just stops the bleeding long enough for you to see the scar. I didn't do it for revenge, I said quietly. He tilted his head. Then what for? For truth, I said. For once I wanted them to see the cost of pretending everything was fine. He leaned back. Then maybe that's enough. I looked at him unsure. You really think so? He shrugged. Sometimes peace doesn't feel good at first. It just feels unfamiliar. We sat in silence for a while. The city lights bled through the blinds, painting his face in soft gold. I wanted to believe him. Before he left, he kissed my forehead. You know, he said, what you did took courage. Not the kind people cheer for, but the kind that changes you. After he was gone, I stood by the window again, the city pulsing quietly below. I could almost picture Grace somewhere across town, surrounded by the ruins of her perfect day. I didn't take pleasure in it, but I also didn't ache anymore. Around midnight, my phone buzzed again. It was a message from Grace. You've made your point. Congratulations. You've humiliated me in front of everyone I know. I hope that feels like justice. I stared at the message for a long time before typing back. Justice would have been being treated like family. What happened today was mercy. I hit send before I could change my mind. The response came minutes later. "You're sick, Hannah. You always were." I didn't reply. Instead, I turned off the lights and walked to my bedroom. The moonlight spilled across the sheets like silver thread. I lay there listening to the hum of traffic, the pulse of a city that didn't care who was right or wrong. For the first time in months, I slept without dreaming. When I woke the next morning, the air felt lighter. The storm had passed, but the ground it left behind was clean, raw, but clean. I brewed coffee, stepped onto the balcony, and looked out over the skyline. Somewhere, my family was probably still trying to rewrite the story, but I wasn't part of their script anymore. I took a slow sip and whispered into the quiet. This is what freedom feels like. And for the first time, the silence didn't scare me. It felt like home. 3 days after the wedding disaster, the world had already moved on, but my family hadn't. The headlines had faded, the memes had been replaced by new ones, but the silence between us had turned to stone. Every day I expected another explosion, another attempt to pull me back into the wreckage. Instead, what came was quieter, sharper. It started with a letter. When I opened the mailbox that morning, it was their white envelope, no return address, my name written in my mother's careful cursive. I stood on the porch for a long moment before taking it inside. My hands shook as I tore it open. "Hannah, you've embarrassed this family beyond words. Grace may never recover from what you've done. Your father and I are humiliated. We raised you better than this. You've proven that spite will always win over love in your heart. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you. Maybe one day you'll understand the pain you've caused. Until then, please do not contact us." It wasn't signed Love Mom, just her name, Margaret. I sat at the kitchen table staring at it, the edges curling slightly from my grip. I read it twice, then folded it back into the envelope, not out of care, but out of habit. I placed it in the drawer where I kept unpaid bills and broken pens. Somewhere it belonged with things that took from me and never gave back. That afternoon, Tessa stopped by. The minute she saw my face, she asked, "What happened?" I handed her the letter. She read it quickly, her jaw tightening with every line. "Wow," she said softly. "That woman really knows how to weaponize guilt." I laughed, but it came out hollow. "She's always been fluent in it." Tessa folded the paper, carefully slid it back across the table. "You don't have to let this in." "I already did," I said. "I just decided not to build a room for it." She smiled faintly. "That's progress." Later, when she left, the quiet returned. I turned on the radio just to drown it out, but even music couldn't fill the space where their voices used to live. I thought about my father, how he used to call every Sunday like clockwork. I wondered if he was still defending me in private, or if he'd already chosen her side again. Maybe silence was easier for him too. That night, as rain began to fall, I sat on the floor of my studio surrounded by photographs I hadn't touched in months. Faces of strangers, captured smiles, moments frozen in light. They all looked so alive, so sure of themselves. I envied them, their stillness, their certainty. I picked up one image of a bride laughing with her father under a string of lanterns. I used to think pictures like that were about joy. Now I knew they were about illusion. I pulled out my camera and set it on the tripod. The lens stared back at me, black and unblinking. I hit the timer and sat in front of it, no makeup, no pretense, just the exhaustion of a woman who had run out of apologies. When the shutter clicked, the sound startled me. It echoed through the room like a truth finally spoken. The photo that came out wasn't pretty. It was raw eyes, red lips, pressed into something between defiance and relief. But it was real. The next day, I sent it to Maria, an old photographer friend I hadn't spoken to in years. "I don't know why I'm sending you this," I wrote, "but I think I finally captured something honest." She replied within an hour. "It's haunting," she said. "You should show it. People need to see what truth looks like." Her words lingered in my mind long after I closed the email. For the first time, I thought about creating something for myself. Not clients, not family, not forgiveness. Just me. By afternoon, I found myself sketching ideas in a notebook. A photography series not about weddings or perfection, but about reclamation, about what happens when you stop trying to belong. The title came easily uninvited. The more I wrote, the clearer it became. This wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about rebirth. I spent the next few days gathering old prints, taking new shots, wandering around the city, with my camera slung over my shoulder. The streets looked different now, like the world had shifted focus. Every cracked sidewalk, every rusted gate, every stranger's tired eyes felt like part of the same story mine. When I showed the first few images to Ethan, he studied them quietly before saying, "You finally stopped hiding behind the lens. I guess I ran out of things to hide from," he smiled. "They're powerful, Hannah. You should do a show." "I'm not ready for that. You were ready the second you took these." His confidence unnerved me, but it also lit something small and steady inside me. That night, I drafted an email to a small downtown gallery I'd worked with years ago. I attached the photos and typed a short message. "These images are about silence, the kind that follows cruelty. Let me know if they speak to you." 2 days later, the curator responded, "They don't just speak, they roar. When can you come in?" When I read it, my hands trembled. For years, my mother had told me to stay quiet, to be gracious, to never take up too much space. And now someone wanted to give me a wall space that was entirely mine. The night before the meeting, I couldn't sleep. The air buzzed with the same nervous energy I used to feel before photographing weddings. Except this time it wasn't about capturing someone else's joy. It was about claiming my own. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. A new message. "Grace, I saw the articles about your art project. Congratulations on turning humiliation into a hobby. You really can't stop making things about yourself, can you?" I read it twice, then deleted it. I didn't need to fight her anymore. She was still living in the fire I'd already walked out of. The next morning, I stood in front of the gallery's white walls, my photos laid out across the table. The curator, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and silver hair, looked at me and said, "You know what I love most about these? They're unapologetic." I smiled. "I spent 30 years learning how to apologize. I think I've retired." She laughed softly. "Good. Then let's give this story a stage." When I left the gallery, the sun was high, the air clean. I walked slowly, feeling the warmth on my skin, the kind I used to shy away from. My phone buzzed again, this time a text from Tessa. "You okay?" I typed back, "Better than okay. I think I'm starting over." For a long moment, I just stood there at the corner of Madison and State, the noise of the city swelling around me. I felt small but not invisible. Somewhere my mother was probably rewriting the family narrative, turning me into the villain again. Somewhere Grace was still nursing her wounds, waiting for me to beg for forgiveness that would never come. But that wasn't my story anymore. I crossed the street, the sun catching the metal of my camera strap. Every step felt like a line drawn further from who I used to be. For the first time, I wasn't walking away. I was walking towards something. Something honest. Something mine. The gallery smelled faintly of paint and old wood when I stepped inside for the setup. Rows of white walls stood waiting, blank and echoing like a confession booth. My photos leaned against them, raw faces, empty rooms, the quiet aftermath of chaos. Each one told a piece of my story, though I hadn't planned it that way. Maria, the curator, moved around briskly with a clipboard. "You sure about the title?" she asked. "Uninvited is bold. It's honest," I said. She smiled. "Then let's hang it that way, honest." As the installation took shape, I stood back and watched my past turn into art. There was the self-portrait from the night of Grace's wedding, my eyes swollen but steady. There was the shot of the empty church I'd photographed weeks later, pews soaked in dust and sunlight. There was the photo of the broken coffee mug I'd dropped the morning my mother disinvited me from Olivia's ceremony. Each one was a chapter frozen in light. Maria came to stand beside me. "You know," she said softly, "it's not revenge that makes this powerful. It's the truth you didn't hide." I nodded. "I think I'm done hiding." The opening night was scheduled for Friday. I didn't tell my family. I didn't send invitations. I didn't post it online. I wanted to see what happened when art had no agenda, no audience I needed to prove anything to. On Thursday night, as I sat at my kitchen table reviewing the final layout, my phone buzzed again. "Grace, you can stop pretending you're some kind of victim now. Everyone knows what you did. Mom says you should apologize before it's too late." I stared at the message, sipping my tea until it went cold. Then I typed back, "I already apologized. Just not to you." I didn't wait for a reply. The next morning, the gallery buzzed with soft chatter and the sound of shuffling feet. People I didn't know drifted through the space, pausing at each photo, whispering to each other. Some smiled sadly, others stood frozen. Watching them was strange, like seeing people read pages of a diary I'd finally stopped locking. A middle-aged woman in a floral scarf approached me. "You took these?" she asked. "Yes. They're painful," she said. "But beautiful. Pain can be beautiful when it stops hiding," I said. She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. "I know what it feels like to be uninvited," she said, almost in a whisper. Then she walked away. For the rest of the evening, people kept sharing small pieces of themselves, snippets of loss, estrangement, betrayal, rebirth. It was humbling. For the first time in my life, being seen didn't feel dangerous. Halfway through the event, Maria rushed over. "There's someone here asking for you," she said. "Older woman. Says she's your mother." My stomach dropped. I hadn't expected her to show up. When I turned, she was standing by the far wall, dressed in her usual perfection, beige coat, pearl earrings, composure sculpted like marble. Her eyes scanned the photos around her, her jaw tightening slightly, each time she recognized a memory. I walked toward her slowly. "Mom." She turned her face unreadable. "So it's true," she said. "You turned our family into a spectacle." "It's not about you," I said evenly. "It's about what you taught me to hide." She looked around the room, voice low but sharp. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? People are talking." "They've always talked," I said. "I just stopped trying to please them." Her eyes flickered. For the first time, I saw something like uncertainty cross her face. "You think this makes you strong. It makes you cruel." "Maybe," I said, "but at least I'm not silent." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she glanced at a photo hanging behind me, the one of me sitting alone on the floor, eyes red, camera beside me. "You look small," she said quietly. I said, "because I was still trying to fit into a picture you approved of." She opened her mouth, but no words came. Instead, she looked away. "Grace doesn't deserve what you did." "She deserved honesty," I said. And so did I. Her eyes met mine again, cold, calculating, but this time, there was something else there too. A fracture. A flicker of something that looked like fear or maybe regret. Before she could speak again, a voice called from the other side of the room. "Hannah, can we get a photo with you by your piece?" I turned. It was Maria, smiling, holding her camera. I nodded, then looked back at my mother. "You don't have to understand it," I said. "You just have to let it exist." She didn't answer. She just stood there, staring at the walls, surrounded by truths she couldn't rearrange. When the flash went off, I smiled. Not the polite kind I used to wear at family dinners, but something smaller, steadier mine. By the time I turned back, she was gone. That night, after the gallery closed, Maria handed me a glass of champagne. "To starting over," she said. I raised my glass. To no longer waiting for permission. The next morning, I found a voicemail from my father. His voice was soft, almost hesitant. "I saw the photos online. They're beautiful, Hannah. Your mother's upset, but I think she needed to see them. I'm proud of you. Call me when you can." I listened to it twice before deleting it. Some words were better remembered as echoes. Later that week, Maria called. "You won't believe this," she said. "A magazine wants to feature your exhibit. They said it captures modern family dynamics, raw, vulnerable, unapologetic." I laughed softly. "Of course they did. It's big, Hannah," she said. "This could change your career." I looked around my studio. The walls were bare again, but the light pouring through the window felt different now, warmer, wider. "I'm not sure I want to chase careers anymore," I said. "I just want to keep telling the truth." "Then keep doing it," she said. "The world's listening now." When the call ended, I walked over to my camera, running my fingers along the cool metal. Outside, the street buzzed with life cars, laughter, the distant hum of music. I lifted the camera and pointed it at the window. For a moment, my reflection stared back at me. "You're not uninvited anymore," I whispered. "You just stopped asking to be included." The shutter clicked. Somewhere in the background, my phone buzzed again, probably another headline, another message from someone who'd decided to interpret my story for me. But I didn't check it. The light was perfect, and for once, that was all I needed. The article hit the internet on a Tuesday morning. I hadn't even known it was coming out yet, but the subject line of Maria's email gave it away. "You're on the front page." I clicked the link, and there it was, my name, in bold letters across a glossy art magazine, followed by a headline that made me laugh and flinch all at once. "The photographer who turned betrayal into art." The piece was surprisingly kind. It talked about Uninvited as a study of truth and silence, about the courage it takes to expose the ugly parts of family love. But even as I read the words, my stomach tightened. Because if there's one thing I'd learned, it's that praise travels slower than outrage, but it still finds its way to the people you wish it wouldn't. By noon, my mother had left a voicemail. "You've humiliated us again," she said, her tone cold, measured, the same voice she used when speaking to strangers. "Now the world knows our private affairs." "How could you?" I didn't respond. I just stared at the screen until her voice faded into static. Then came Grace's text. "You really built a career off destroying me. Congrats." I typed back, "You built your image off erasing me. We're even." Then I deleted it before sending. I wasn't doing this dance anymore. Instead, I poured myself coffee, opened my curtains, and looked out at the lake. The morning light shimmered across the water, pale and gentle, and for a second I felt untouchable. Around noon, Ethan came over carrying lunch from a deli downtown. He placed the bag on the counter and said, "You've been trending on art blogs for 3 hours." I raised an eyebrow. "That's oddly specific." He grinned. "Maria called me. She said you're officially a name." I snorted. "A name? I've been one my whole life. It's just that now people are finally spelling it right." He leaned against the counter, his expression soft. "How do you feel?" "Exposed," I admitted. "But not afraid." "Good," he said. "Because this," he gestured toward the laptop still open on the article, "isn't scandal anymore. It's survival turned into art. That's power." I looked at him and smiled faintly. "You always know how to translate my chaos into poetry." He shrugged. "Someone has to keep up with you." After lunch, he helped me sort through prints for a second exhibition Maria wanted to curate in New York. As he flipped through each photo, he paused at one, the self-portrait I'd taken after Grace's wedding. "This one," he said. "It's the heart of it all, isn't it?" I nodded. "It's where everything stopped pretending." He turned it over, and on the back I had scribbled something months ago without thinking. "Truth doesn't need permission to exist." He read it out loud and smiled. "You should put that on the wall next time." That night, I received an email from an unknown address. The subject line read, "Your sister isn't doing well." For a long moment, I didn't open it. I didn't want to know. But curiosity won. It was from Dad. His tone was gentle, the way it always was when he wanted to cushion Mom's chaos. "Grace has been staying with us. She's not sleeping, not eating much. I think she feels lost. She won't say it, but I know she's been reading the things written about you. Maybe you should call her." I read the message twice, then closed the laptop. No, not yet. The next day, I went to the gallery early. Maria was there crouched over a new set of frames. "You're glowing," she said when she saw me. "I didn't sleep," I said. "Does that count as glowing?" She laughed. "If exhaustion looks like peace, then yes." We walked through the exhibit together. Each photo hung like a scar that had finally closed. She stopped at one image, an empty chair bathed in sunlight. "This one," she said softly. "It feels like forgiveness." I didn't answer. After the gallery closed, I went home, poured a glass of wine, and stared at my phone. Grace's contact sat there untouched. My thumb hovered over it for a long time. Finally, I called. It rang 6 times before she answered. Her voice was tired, brittle. "I knew you'd call. I wasn't going to," I said. "But Dad emailed me." She scoffed softly. "Of course he did. Always the messenger." There was a pause. I could hear faint music in the background, the kind you play when you don't want to sit in silence. I saw the article, she said finally. "They made you sound like some kind of saint. The brave artist who found redemption through pain." "I didn't write it." "But you lived it," she snapped. "And I'm the villain in your story now." I took a deep breath. "You made yourself the villain when you took my venue and called me bitter. You could have just said no. You didn't have to destroy everything." "I did say no," I said quietly. "You just never listened." There was another long silence. I almost hung up, but then she said something I didn't expect. "I don't hate you," she whispered. "I just don't know how to forgive you." I closed my eyes, letting the words sink in. "You don't have to," I said. "Just stop pretending I don't exist." The line went quiet again. Then she said, "Mom's sick of talking about it. Dad's trying to pretend we're all fine. And me, I can't go anywhere without people asking about you. I didn't want fame, Grace." "Maybe not," she said, her voice cracking, "but you got it anyway." I didn't know what to say. The space between us felt too wide, too heavy. So I said the only thing that felt true. "We were both raised to compete for love that was never freely given." I stopped playing. "You can too." For a moment, I thought she might hang up. But then she said, "I don't know who I am without it." "Then find out," I said softly. "You might like her." When the call ended, I sat there for a long time, staring at the city lights flickering through my window. For the first time, I didn't feel angry at her. Just sad for both of us. The next morning, I opened my inbox to find another message from my father. "Thank you for calling her," she cried after. "I think she needed it. We all did." Attached was a photo of Grace sitting on the porch at their house, her head tilted toward the light. It was blurry, unposed. For a moment I saw what I'd always tried to capture in my work, truth quiet and unguarded. I closed the email and smiled faintly. Later that afternoon, Ethan came over with flowers. "For the famous artist," he said, setting them down. "I don't think I'm famous," I said. "You are to the right people," he replied. We sat by the window watching the sunset turn the lake gold. He turned to me, eyes soft. "So what's next?" I exhaled. "I don't know. Maybe a new series. Something about rebirth." He nodded. "Call it light again. It suits you." I laughed quietly. "You're terrible at naming things," maybe he said. "But I'm good at recognizing when someone's finally free." As the last of the sunlight slipped behind the skyline, I realized he was right. Freedom didn't arrive with fanfare or fireworks. It came quietly, in moments like this, a glass of wine, a soft laugh, the hum of peace settling into a space that had been empty for too long. I leaned my head on his shoulder, the city glowing beyond us. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "No," I said. "Regret belongs to the version of me who waited for permission." Outside the night deepened, but the air felt warm. And for the first time, I didn't think about what my family might be saying. I just sat there bathed in the golden echo of my own light. The day of my second exhibit felt nothing like the first. There were no nerves, no shaking hands, no restless heartbeats waiting for approval. Just calm. The kind that comes after you've already lost everything you were afraid to lose. The gallery was brighter this time, larger, with tall windows that caught the morning light. The walls were lined with new photographs, each one softer than the last. The series was called Light Again. Maria had insisted on the title. "It's who you are now," she said as she pinned the final label beside a frame. "You took pain and turned it into proof." The opening crowd began to trickle in students, artists, critics, people who'd seen the article and wanted to meet the woman who turned betrayal into beauty. But the truth was, the story wasn't about betrayal anymore. It was about release. I stood near the entrance, greeting guests as they passed. Some stopped to talk, some cried, some just nodded quietly and moved on. There was something sacred about watching strangers find themselves in your pain. By noon I saw him, my father, standing at the doorway. He looked older than I remembered, his shoulders slightly slumped, his eyes heavy. For a moment, I froze. Then he smiled, small, uncertain, and walked toward me. "Dad," I said softly. "You didn't think I'd miss this, did you?" I smiled faintly. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Your mother didn't want me to," he admitted. "But sometimes you have to pick peace, not the person." I exhaled slowly. "Thank you for coming." He looked around the gallery, taking in the photographs. "They're honest," he said finally. "Your mother wouldn't understand them. But I do." His voice broke slightly on the last word, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. Pride. We stood together in silence for a moment before he reached into his pocket and handed me a folded piece of paper. "She wanted me to give you this." I hesitated before taking it. "Another letter," he nodded. "This one's different." When he walked away, I sat on a nearby bench and unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, uneven. "Hannah, I watched your interview. You looked calm. Maybe for the first time I saw you instead of the version I made you be. I don't expect forgiveness. I only want you to know I see what I missed. You were never too much. I was just too afraid of being less." Mom, I read it twice, my vision blurring halfway through. The words weren't an apology, not exactly, but they were something close to recognition, and maybe that was enough. When I looked up, Ethan was standing across the room watching me. I wiped my eyes, smiled, and he walked over. "You okay?" "I think so," I said. "She finally saw me." He smiled softly. "Took her long enough." I laughed through the ache. "Yeah. But I guess light travels slow." That afternoon, the crowd grew thicker. Maria gave a short speech, her voice echoing through the room. "This exhibit," she said, "isn't just about healing. It's about reclaiming space. About the moment a woman stops editing herself to fit someone else's frame." People applauded, but I barely heard them. I was watching the sunlight move across the floor, golden and shifting like it was painting everything it touched. When the event ended, I stayed behind to help close up. The gallery emptied until it was just me and Maria. She looked at me with that knowing smile of hers. "You did it," she said. "I didn't fix everything," I said. "No," she replied. "But you stopped breaking yourself to fix others. That's the real art." Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city. Ethan and I walked down the street in comfortable silence, our hands brushing occasionally. "You know, it's crazy," he said. "The first time I saw you, you were photographing someone else's story. Now the world's photographing yours." I smiled. Maybe that's what growing up is, realizing you were never just the observer. We stopped at a cafe near the lake, the same one where I'd spent countless mornings trying to disappear behind a mug of coffee. The waitress recognized me from the article and brought over 2 drinks on the house. "For the brave one," she said, winking. I laughed. "I'm not brave. I'm just done being quiet." Ethan leaned back, watching me with that steady gaze I'd come to depend on. "So what's next?" "I'm thinking of teaching," I said. "Workshops, maybe. Helping other photographers tell their stories, the ones they've been too afraid to frame." He nodded. "You'd be good at that." "I just want to remind people that truth doesn't always look perfect. Sometimes it looks like survival." He smiled. "That's your next headline." As we left the cafe, the sky had turned pink, fading to lavender over the water. I stopped to take a photo, my instinct returning like muscle memory. The light was soft, imperfect, human. I clicked the shutter. The image froze mid-breath, the lake, the fading sun, and the reflection of two figures standing close but unposed. When I looked at the screen, I smiled. "It's not perfect," I said. Ethan looked at the picture over my shoulder. "That's why it's beautiful." We walked home as the city lights began to flicker on one by one like small promises against the dark. That night, as I sat on my balcony, the letter from my mother still in my pocket, I thought about everything that had led here. The fights, the silence, the empty ballroom, the laughter I'd thought I'd never hear again. For the first time, none of it hurt. It just existed. I took out my camera again, pointed it at the horizon, and whispered, "Thank you." Not to them, but to the version of me who'd finally stopped waiting to be chosen. The shutter clicked. Weeks later, the Light Again exhibit was featured in Harper's Bazaar. The article described it as a visual symphony of self-acceptance. They called me the woman who redefined the art of reclamation. But the line that made me pause was the last one: "She no longer photographs light. She has become it." The night that issue came out, my sister sent a message. "I saw the photos. They're beautiful. Maybe someday you can teach me how to see things the way you do." I typed back, slowly smiling. "You already do. You just have to stop looking through Mom's lens. No drama, no closure speech, just honesty." As I set the phone down, I heard the waves from the lake brushing against the shore outside my window. The sound was soft and rhythmic, like breathing. I poured a glass of wine, stepped onto the balcony, and looked at the city below, alive, shimmering, unfiltered. I had once been the sister left out, the daughter silenced, the woman accused of being too much. Now I was the storyteller, the artist, the proof that light doesn't ask permission to exist. And as the night settled around me, I smiled and whispered to the quiet world below, "If you've ever been uninvited, remember you don't need a door to walk into your own story." Then I lifted my camera one last time and took the picture. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and if you've ever had to fight for your own light. Because if you have, then you already know your glow was never theirs to dim.